Good evening, or good afternoon. Folks, if you could grab your seats, we'd like to get the last panel of the afternoon going here. I'm John Theobold, Vince Matthews, David Fridley up here. We're going to take these discussions in a different direction momentarily. I'd like to start with a quick announcement, and actually just a comment and a word of thanks. You heard a thanks from Steve to our sponsors earlier. I want to mention one of them again. The Sacramento Municipal Utility District invited Steve and I to make a peak oil presentation there last month, and it was a really exciting experience being with these folks who run a municipal utility here in Sacramento County, and their knowledge of what's going on is quite impressive. A lot of times we come to these events and walk away with a sense of gloom, but it was really invigorating speaking with these folks and impressed at what they knew. And we appreciate their sponsorship of this conference as well. Bruce Boucher, Bruce, where are you? Standing right there. This gentleman right here, Bruce Boucher, executive of SMUD. He is going to be available at 5:30 out by the swimming pool in the American flag after the presentations today. And what he's interested in is meeting with people that would be interested in putting together a peak oil task force, using the Portland group as a model. Bruce will be out there if you're interested in that. So good work on that. Thanks for offering to do that. We are focusing for the next hour plus on that part of the world where more than half the world's population lives. We've titled this panel, 4 Billion New Consumers: The Effects of Asian Growth on East, West, and the World. It's pretty easy to get depressed looking at this topic. You can look down the block in some Chinese cities and not be able to see the end of the block. We can look at the CO2 numbers. If you've seen an excellent documentary called Manufactured Landscapes, Kurt Cobb wrote a very good piece about it. And you see people who are digging into our e-waste, digging into our computers that we've discarded with their hands to pull out the small bits of heavy metals for recycling, to get a real sense of what's meant by that. There's a lot to be depressed about when you look at that story, but it is at the same time a really incredible story. I think of another documentary called A Cadillac Desert, where the environmental writer Mark Reesner says no matter how much you hate dams, no matter how much you're worried about the environmental consequences of dams, you cannot go to the Hoover Dam without looking at it and just being amazed at the immensity of that project. And I had a small feeling there just from the pictures that Maury showed you earlier, the Google Earth pictures of the various places, including the Three Gorges Dam. But this is something on a much bigger scale, and as challenging it is, sometimes it just pays, I think, to sit back and look at the story and really be amazed at what's going on. As Herman said in the previous panel, people who are aspiring to the same things that we have, and it really is an amazing story. One of the titles we kicked around for this panel initially was The Biggest Story in the World, and Sally Odland said that wasn't a good title because it didn't tell people what it was about, and she was right, she usually is. But I think it is the biggest story in the world in so many different respects, and we have two of our favorite people here to tell us about that story. We're going to start with David Fridley. The well-traveled Mandarin-speaking Mr. Fridley has spent a lot of the last 30 years in China. He's spent the last 3 decades studying China with a focus on energy, work on supply, demand, modeling international trade, international energy policy. In recent years, he has been collaborating with the Chinese to work on promoting energy efficiency and modeling of that, and modeling of various sorts. Post-Carbon has quite a presence, deservedly so at this conference. David is a fellow with Post-Carbon. He also is the author of the Peak Oil Initiative passed by the San Francisco County Board of Supervisors. If you can get the San Francisco County Board of Supervisors to agree on anything, you got something going for you. He comes to us from Lawrence Berkeley Laboratories. The title of his talk is China Energy in the 21st Century. David Fridley.
Okay, now for something completely different. I was really glad that China was a standalone topic at this conference because China has really been the boogeyman in a lot of the discussion about why oil prices have been rising so much over the last 3 or 4 years. And so what I would like to do today is to offer a more in-depth look about how China uses oil, how China uses energy overall, to try to give you a little better look about what the dynamics there are. Now, I know this is a peak oil conference, but the bald fact about China is that coal dominates everything. If you look at just its what's called the reserve base, coal is 97% of what China possesses. Globally, oil and gas share about 20% of global fossil resources. In China, they're minuscule, just together just 3% of what they possess. This is the reason China was built on coal, continues to rely on coal, and will always rely on coal. But understanding this also is really critical to understanding what ultimately the dynamics in the oil and gas market are as well. So let's look a little more at coal before we turn to oil and gas. China is undoubtedly the largest coal-based economy in the world. Its consumption in 2007 of all energy forms is about 40 million barrels a day of oil equivalent, of which coal is about 75% of that total. And even though China has completely transformed since 1980, that was the year I first set foot in China, yet one thing hasn't changed. Coal was 70% of China's energy consumption in 1970 or 1980, and it's remains 70% today. What's really changed is the GDP that's been fed by this increase in energy consumption is now more than 10 times higher. I've added biomass in here because, one, to show that China already heavily exploits this form of energy. You have 800 million rural residents, or nearly 3 times the US population, that rely primarily on this biomass, which also means that they have little latitude to, as the phrase is anymore, to repurpose it for any other fuel use. But it also means as China urbanizes, this is the fraction of energy that's going to be substituted by yet more fossil fuels. How does, China differs from the US in many ways, and in a primary way is its structure of energy among the different sectors of the economy. In the US, generally we see it's 1/3 transport, 1/3 industry, 1/3 residential and commercial and buildings. In China, industry dominates everything. It is the largest consumer of every energy form in China, and if you want to understand the dynamics of Chinese energy, you have to know where industry is going. And a lot of energy is, or industry is heavy industry. I've broken that out here and showed just the contribution of ethylene, paper, aluminum, cement, and iron and steel, which are now among the largest, and certainly in the case of cement, the far largest of these industrial sectors in the world. And China has a current program that they're now calling the Top 1,000 Enterprise Program. And this is one of their mechanisms to try to bring their energy consumption under control. And just these 1,000 enterprises account for half of industrial energy consumption, and a lot of hope is being placed on their ability to reach their targets in 2010 to bring China's demand under control. You'll see in contrast, transport remains a very small proportion of total Chinese demand. So what's driving this growth in Chinese coal consumption? And it's electric power. When I first lived in China in 1980, 80% of Chinese coal was used directly. That means direct end use in industry. It was what I used to burn to cook with. It's what I burned to heat with. And only about 20% went to electric power. But now we see it's the opposite. The transformation uses, the turning coal into something more useful, which of course thermodynamically always means that you have a lot of loss included, into electricity and into metallurgical coke. Now, for electric power, this has been the single largest driver for this entire century so far. And if you think back to Lenin's dictum, he said that communism equals Soviet power plus electrification of the country. Well, in that regard, China is heading very quickly towards communism. So how is China generating electricity? Coal remains dominant. 80% of every kilowatt that comes out of China is generated by coal. You hear about, the Three Gorges Dam being the largest dam in the world. You hear about their ambitious plan to build nuclear and the Daya Bay and the Qinshan power plants. You hear about their deployment of wind and their dramatic increase, doubling last year in wind capacity. And yet if you stack that up against coal, what you see is that they're just a small fraction, and indeed that fraction's falling over time as coal becomes even more predominant. Just last year, China added 105 gigawatts of new generation capacity, of which 90% was coal-based. What that means is that in 1 year, and they've done this now for 3 years running, is essentially built the California grid twice over every single year, 90% based on coal. But China, as you saw in the resource base, and also you have a certain inertia just from your industrial structure and your economic structure, has very few options to offset this dependency on coal. China is not a big natural gas producer, and it's already a net importer of gas. We'll look a little bit more at that later. If they wanted to offset 1 year of their growth, they'd have to import an additional 100 billion cubic meters of natural gas, which is equivalent to 3 large international scale natural gas pipelines coming from somewhere. China is now just building their first international pipeline that will be done around 2012. If it were to be used to supplant coal in power generation, it's just as daunting. Natural gas is more efficient than coal in generation, so you'd need less, but it's still about 3 pipelines worth of natural gas to bring it in. In 2020, China hopes to reach 40 gigawatts of nuclear power capacity. They'd have to build that every year to offset coal. The Three Gorges Dam you saw this morning, 17 gigawatts, largest dam in the world. They'd have to build 5 of those every year to offset 1 year of coal use increase. And China's now launched to the top league of wind producers in the world. They're adding 4 gigawatts this year. They'd have to do 140 gigawatts a year to offset 1 year of coal growth. And so China's rich in coal. It has the 3rd largest known reserves in the world. And in the early 2000s, it became one of the major coal exporters in the Asia-Pacific region. And they have a lot of very good coking coal. And so Japan became an important importer of metallurgical coal, Korea for thermal coal for power generation. But as their own demand soared, their ability to maintain the exports dwindled quickly to the point where at the end of last year, they were just a net 2 on the exports, and they've been bouncing back and forth this year, having due more to price differentials between domestic and international markets than anything else. Well, what concerns me is what I call the 4th wedge, which is China's plans to use coal in coal to liquids and in coal to chemicals. And they're being, part of this is their own idea, part of it they're being encouraged by large international chemical companies, some of which have already set up joint ventures to look at this in more depth. This year, China will get their first coal to liquids plant by the Shenhua Corporation in Inner Mongolia. It'll be commissioned this year. And the declared intention for expansion in this sector is 50 to 60 million tons of capacity by 2020. But, this isn't just a matter of how many billions of dollars you have to put on the ground. I like to look at it from a physical point of view. How much resources does it require to develop an economy or a sector like that? And in China, for indirect or direct liquefaction, you need anywhere between 4 and 5.5 tons of mine mouth coal to be able to produce 1 ton of this liquid that they're developing for the output. But what even more worrying is it's 10 tons of water per 1 ton of the liquid output. And this is a very unfortunate thing and will probably lead to some real problems in China. More than 70% of China's coal resources are in 4 provinces in northern China. And these 4 provinces contain 4% of China's water resources. And northern China is already critically water short. It's rated physically water short. And this is certainly not, this is certainly an exacerbation of it. An interesting development in the last few years has been what methanol has done. China's long had a small-scale coal-to-methanol program, largely centered in the province of Shanxi. But with the collapse of the grain-to-ethanol program last year, and China learned more quickly than we're learning the irrationality of doing that when you have 4 times the population of the U.S. and half the amount of arable land as the U.S., that program came to the end. But what spontaneously jumped in to take it up is methanol blending in gasoline. And so all of a sudden, we had mainly methanol going for chemical purposes being blended throughout northern China to extend the gasoline pool. Methanol only has 50% of the energy as gasoline, but this is taken off to the point now there are national standards on blending 10%, 50%, 90%, and 100%. But we have the same thing. It's 1.5 to 1.7 tons of coal, additional coal that has to be mined for every ton of methanol that they want to use in these programs. So the question does arise, can China produce the coal it needs? What I've done here is 2 things. One is to look at a projection of what Chinese coal demand would be under certain conditions. The conditions here include, first and foremost, that we do not have a financial meltdown globally. Second, that Chinese steel and cement production will peak by 2015 at levels commensurate to development in Korea or Japan. And that all Chinese industrial sectors will meet their 2020 efficiency targets by that time. So we have high efficiency growth, a peaking in the largest sectors that consume coal, and yet we see a demand path that looks like this, to which I have added what it would require in additional coal for them to reach these coal to liquids targets on top of that. What I've set up against it is, one, the IEA's demand-driven supply forecast, which even under their assumptions opens up a gap by the 2015s. An earlier Energy Watch Group forecast, which was done on a much earlier, much smaller reserve base, but I put it here for reference, and a much better study done by 2 Chinese researchers at Shenyang University in Northeast China, Tao and Li, who did a Stella model of Chinese coal supply. And yet again, we see this gap opening up. So, in some cases, this gap would be about as big as 1 billion tons, which obviously isn't possible. But nonetheless, China's going to have difficulty filling any coal gap because currently its largest source of imports is Vietnam. Vietnam is building its own power plants left and right. Its demand for power is going up 14 to 16% a year, and they've declared that they're going to stop exports by next year. Indonesia was the savior of the Asia-Pacific coal trade because of its doubling of output and filling the demand. But its own electricity demand based on coal, which are being built by Chinese companies, the power plants, is rising fast because of their own gas problem internally. And then we have Australia, where be it they're more concerned with environmental issues or so forth, calls into question their ability to greatly increase their exports. And then you have China, whose own needs for imports are going to grow, up against India, which has a very poor quality coal and has already declared long-term plans to import a great deal of coal, primarily from Indonesia. And then you have Japan, who periodically has surges in coal import demand because of their nuclear and LNG problems, which may be exacerbated after 2012 as well. So you have an Asia-Pacific region where the entire volume of traded coal is only 350 million tons. So I think China is going to pretty much hit the wall on coal sometime in the middle of the next decade. There's also consequences to all of this. We all know that China's total CO2 emissions have exceeded that of the United States. On this same demand track that I laid out before, China's CO2 emissions just from coal will exceed those of the United States in 2010. I mean, when China builds 100 gigawatts of coal-fired power plants, those power plants are putting out 500 million tons of CO2. So effectively in 1 year, China wipes out the entire Kyoto commitment of the EU to 2012 and it's even more than if the U.S. had joined Kyoto and had added that, is wiped out by these increases. But unlike coal, China's 50% import dependent on oil. Its own crude production has plateaued. Imports have soared, and now their import dependency, if you count both crude oil imports and net imports of refined products, is about 50%. And the mainstay of China's oil industry in the past was this giant field Daqing, which we saw this morning was the 9th largest field in the world. Daqing peaked in 1997 and has been in decline ever since. I'm showing here this exponential increase in the decline rate, which has now reached 4% per year. The profile of Daqing looks very much like Prudhoe Bay, and I expect it to continue in that same trend, although if you read the Chinese press, they are now, or the engineers at Daqing say that they're going to maintain production at 40 million tons or 800,000 barrels a day, which is where they are now, for the next 10 years, but I have great doubts about that. What this has mean is, like elsewhere in the world, as China has lost reliance on its giant and supergiant fields, it's had to turn to its smaller and offshore fields, and that means the energetic cost of getting that energy from oil fields has risen dramatically. And even though there was this statistical readjustment in 2004 that reallocated some of the energy of that sector away to the refining sector, nonetheless, what we see since 1985 is that the energy cost, direct energy cost of getting the oil out of China has tripled to about 15%, which means that it's equivalent to about 1/7 of the energy content of the oil that they produce. Now, China has a very complex refining system. It's the second most complex refining system in the world after the United States, although it's structured very differently. We have a lot of reliance on hydrocracking and coking. China relies primarily upon various flavors of fluid catalytic cracking that they've developed themselves, and they're very good at it. But China is a diesel-based economy, like many that you'll see in Asia. Gasoline is a secondary product there. It's only half the amount of what is demanded in diesel, and they've essentially destroyed as much fuel demand as they can. But the structure of oil demand in China is very different from the United States and very different from other large consuming countries. And I think this is a very important point, because when we try to interpret the impact of high crude prices on China, we really need to take these things into consideration. And so what you can see here is that, yes, industry is still a large chunk, although certainly not as much as it is for coal or electricity. You see a very large chunk that goes directly to feedstocks. This is about 10% of their total into petrochemicals, whereas in the US, I believe that number is more on the order of about 4 or 5%. Commerce, construction, and agriculture are absolutely critical. In Chinese agriculture, 2/3 of their irrigation, which is almost required throughout northern China, is run by diesel pumps. And of course, the tractors run on diesel as well. And if you've been to any Chinese city and seen those construction cranes everywhere to the point it's now considered the national bird, all of those equipment run upon diesel. And so this construction boom that China is under, which is adding 3 billion square meters of building space every year, that's 30 billion square feet of new building space, is being run on diesel. So these are pretty much non-discretionary uses of oil. China did not have the decades to build up waste. It really became a major oil consumer in the 1990s, and it put oil to its highest value use. It never had a period where power generation or heat from oil was very significant at all. And still today we see transportation use of oil is about 43% of the total, compared to about 2/3 in the US. But even there, the structure is very different in the US, and therefore the dynamics of the market is different. What we see is, the headline story is always China car sales go up so much. But if you actually look at the numbers, the amount of oil that's consumed by what I call a personal car, which means a car owned by an individual for whom who pays the operating cost of running that car and uses it at their discretion is only about 4% of the total, and it's only about a quarter of all the gasoline that's used. So yes, car sales have been rising at double digits from a very low base, but currently right now, personal cars, they're a congestion issue, they're a pollution issue, but they are not the main driver of Chinese oil demand. What we do find though is that moving stuff is a much stronger driver of Chinese oil demand than moving people. And this is, you know, for several reasons. I mean, China is still a very material economy. They don't run on bits and bytes and things like that. They still produce things and they have to move it. The first thing they have to move is coal. China in 2000, China produced 1 billion tons of coal. And 80% of that coal ran on China's rail system, which is a very efficient rail system. It's now 77,000 kilometers in length, and the actual locomotives match the energy efficiency of those found in Japan. It's a very efficient system, not operated necessarily efficiently, but equipment-wise, it's very efficient. And so 80% of their coal was moved by rail, and this is the most efficient way that they have to get this from those northern provinces that have the coal to the coasts where it needed and where all the power plants are. However, in 2007, China produced 2.4 billion tons of coal. And so the rail system simply could not keep up. And so only about 55% of that coal actually found space on the rail system. And part of it, of course, moves in China's inland and coastal waterways. But the rest of it had to go over to trucks. And China has built the equivalent of the US interstate system with trucks. And so what we see is that just that shift, that modal shift from being able to carry all of just coal from the rail system and this growing dependency on the road system has dramatically increased the amount of diesel that's needed to move that coal around the country. I mean, in China, when you move a ton from a rail system to a truck, you increase the amount of energy you need by 16 times. This has indirect effects. Coal crowded out everything else on the rail system, and so freight that can no longer be moved on the rail system is also moving to truck. And so just getting raw materials in, manufacturing products out, and energy, cement, and oil around the country is a major driver of energy, of oil use. On top of that, we have a mishmash and what I like seeing the same phrase this morning, a whack-a-mole energy or pricing policy where some crude oil prices and fuel oil and LPG are absolutely free, gasoline and diesel are controlled, tiered pricing and various controls everywhere else, all around in this attempt to keep energy affordable to certain segments of the economy, particularly farmers and fertilizer producers for the farmers as cheap as possible. China is only about 1/10 the size of the US in its use of natural gas, but it came into the 21st century expecting that this was going to be the century for natural gas. They were going to clean up everything with natural gas, and indeed they planned out the equivalent of about 30 million tons of LNG import capacity by the year 2010. But what they didn't really take into account at the time is that the fact that the $3 and $4 a million BTU that they had originally got for their first LNG plant was a thing of the past. And when they started seeing $8 and $9 and $10, they really pulled back on their LNG plans. But they're also looking over at South Korea and Japan, and they're seeing those spot cargoes coming in the winter at $20 and $22 a million BTU, and they have pretty much come to an accommodation that no, they're never going to see $3 a million BTU again, and now they're out there again looking for those deals to try to find supply. And to hedge their bets, they've come to an agreement with Turkmenistan in a project that's been discussed, oh God, I remember it from 1989, but is coming to fruition to bring Turkmen gas up through Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and to link into the second West-East pipeline that will then 30 billion cubic meters deliver this to southern China and to points through central China. So I'd like to show this picture because I think people should visualize what China's growth means. And what you're seeing here is a is a picture from space of eastern China, the Shandong Peninsula, looking towards Korea, and that brown cloud is China's pollution. China now is the largest source of mercury deposition here in California. So I'm going to run out of time, but I want to quickly look at what the generation of this crisis is. China achieved something no other country in the world did, and that was to quadruple the size of its GDP during 20 years from 1980 to 2000 by only doubling the amount of energy it used to do it. That's absolutely unprecedented. And in 2000, they said, we're going to do it again. By 2020, quadruple GDP, double energy, but it didn't work out that way. A boom. The economy boomed. They entered the WTO. A new premier came in and relaxed credit, and actual energy has grown much faster than GDP today is. And the major cause of this is the huge, tremendous increase in heavy industry. China produces more cement now. As you can see here, their forecasts were way off all through the early 2000s. They produce more cement now than every other country in the world combined. Iron and steel as well. And this is not stuff China's exporting to the U.S. They're building urban areas. They're planning to reach 55% urbanization by 2020, which means building urban infrastructure, housing, sewage, everything for 300 million people or for every person in the United States. That's what's driving cement and steel demand. And this structural increase in demand for energy completely offset this long-term decline in energy intensity in each of these industrial sectors. So it scared the government. They instituted in 2005 a new target to reduce the energy intensity of the economy by 20% by 2010, what's now everyone just calls the 2010 target. And there's two sides to this. If they actually achieve the target, they will have avoided emitting the amount of CO2 that the country of Poland emits today, or about 480 million tons of CO2. But the other side of it, it's still a growth target. So it's not that they will have actually reduced energy use, they will just have reduced their growth of energy use. So if you look at all this, I just want to end on the words of one of the more remarkable Chinese officials that I've ever met, Mr. Pan Yue, who's Minister of the Environment Protection, and he lays it out very clearly that all of these elements of the economy, their use of energy and natural resources, their environmental destruction, and their social structure and the growing disparities between rich and poor is unsustainable. So I'd like to add to that, add peak oil into this, and China indeed faces a very uncertain future. Thank you.
That's hit this one. Yeah, I got it. Okay. Good. All right, thank you. We're in our 9th hour. I always think it's impressive. You look around this room this far into one of these conferences and everybody's still here. I think it's testimony to the quality of these presentations that we can absorb this much data. I'm thinking about my experience in the first couple of ASPOs that I attended, though. I found a cartoon, and you see that. And I guess more realistically, there we go. I don't know if you can read that. I don't think Mr. Andrews is going to be excusing anyone quite yet, but our brains are getting full. We need a little more space in the hard drive right now, though, at least if last year in Houston is any indication. You show up at a peak oil conference and you expect to hear about peak oil and gas and probably coal as well. We got all that last year. We also got peak indium and vanadium and chromium and uranium and a lot more things. If you're not very familiar with the role of other commodities and minerals, you're about to be much more familiar with the situation we face. If you already are familiar, you're going to have some numbers to attach to these. And our tour guide for this excursion here, this part of the excursion, is Vince Matthews. You know Vince, a lot of you, is a Colorado, and he's also got some California credentials. He received a PhD in geology from one of the campuses of our university system, UC Santa Cruz, which, by the way, makes him a banana slug, the UC Santa Cruz banana slugs. I guess all the mascots, the good mascots were taken, or maybe that is a good one. It fits Santa Cruz. It's a great university and about as nicely located as you can imagine. Vince is the author of several dozen technical articles on geology. He's worked with oil, he's worked with gas, he's worked with coal, he's explored on land, at sea, pretty much everywhere in the United States. My pleasure to present the State Geologist of Colorado and the Director of the Colorado Geological Survey, Vince Matthews.
While he's getting that set up, I'd like to just start with a couple of things. I'd like to thank Steve and Randy and the Board of Directors of ASPO and the members of ASPO for being ASPO. The work that this organization is doing is just extremely important, and I feel so grateful that you all do support this and are doing it. The second is I'd like to make clear that we're not the USGS and we're not part of the USGS. What I'd like to do is to expand a little bit beyond just oil. I'll mention it briefly, but I'd like to take a look at what China, India, and the U.S. are doing to the world mineral situation as well as the other energy situations, because minerals are really off the radar screen, and what's going on there in some respects is perhaps a little bit more earth-shaking than what's going on in oil. It's obviously the people resources that are driving the demand for natural resources, and we've just heard a wonderful expose of what's going on in detail in China, but they're 1.3 billion to our 0.3 billion and about 1 billion in India. It's interesting that the subcontinent of India is only about a third the 10 million square miles that China and the U.S. have. In GDP, we're still the largest one on the block, although some of these bankrupt investment houses now predicted that in 2030, by 2030, China's liable to pass us in GDP. And one of the ones that failed this week predicted that by 2050, India might pass us. And the reason is that their GDP is growing much more rapidly than ours. China's had 4 years of an average growth of 10.4% per year. It hasn't varied more than about 0.5% each way. India between 7 and 10%, and we're real excited that we're at 3.5. World electrical consumption, the growth in that in the last 17 years, I think really frames what's going on in the whole globe in terms of natural resource consumption. The world increased its consumption of electricity in the last 17 years by 8 terawatts. More than half of that was these 3 countries alone. 55%. And when we break that out, we find that China was the bulk of that growth. But one of the things that's really very important, in China's growth curve during the 20th century was quite robust, but you can see that in the 21st century it took off dramatically. And really in all of the consumptions of all these mineral resources, it's the 21st century explosion that we see happening. And much of that actually even since 2003, just in the last 5 years. One of the things that's important to remember is that we can't forget about that other 45% of the world that all want their piece of the pie also, and they've been also increasing their consumption of natural resources. Well, people say, doesn't China have their own mineral resources and their own production? And they certainly do. They're number 1 in the world in production of these commodities, number 2 of this, and number 3 of these. So 14 of 15 very important commodities, they're either the top 1, 2, or 3 producer. But if we take a look at copper, where they're the number 2 producer in the world, up until the end of the 20th century, they produced about as much copper as they consumed, and then they outstripped that. Today, they're the number 1 importer of copper in the world, and they have to import almost half of what they consume. Why do we care? Well, the price of copper has increased dramatically during this period of time. When you talk to the little manufacturer out in western Colorado who makes these switches for the coal mines that handle 10 or 20,000 volts at a time, you hear this tale of woe about how difficult it is to plan his business He doesn't know what copper's going to cost the next time around. He doesn't know what to charge people. The thefts have increased all over the country. We had 2,300 pounds of copper stolen from 2 different substations in North Denver. A week later, somebody was arrested on a construction site in Pueblo. I took a little walk 3 days ago along an old railroad track down in the Colorado mountains, and once we got out of sight of the road, every single telephone line had been sawed off with a chainsaw and the copper stripped from it. We had a couple of houses, these foreclosed homes in North and South Denver, plywood on the windows and on the doors and spray painted on them, or no copper to try to keep people from breaking in again. If you've been to Home Depot to buy anything with copper in it, you know what it is. And here's an old 1800s copper mine in Colorado that's been drilled out in the last few years with the intention of starting it back up. If we look at iron ore, where they're the #1 producer in the world of iron ore, they have also, that was pretty much okay for them up until the end of the 20th century. Their imports began increasing dramatically, and now they're the #1 importer of iron ore in the world. So they're the #1 importer and the #1 producer of iron ore in the world. And it's all because of the steel and the building that's going on. Shanghai had 1 skyscraper in 1985. In 2005, it had over 300. If you do the math on that, that's 1.5, more than 1 skyscraper every single month for 20 straight years, and that's 1 city. The numbers for China are just staggering. A lot of steel and a lot of concrete used in making supermarkets. They became the #3 car manufacturer, which takes a lot of steel. In 2006 and 2007, they became the #2 car market in the world. Chairman Mao started the concept of the 5-year plan back in the 50s. Unlike the Russians that never saw a 5-year plan that they could meet, the Chinese tend to meet them, and they're going to spend a lot more money on this one that was rolled out last year, and they're going to do a lot of building. So the price of steel has increased dramatically, scrap iron up a tremendous amount just in the last 5 years. All of these charts that I'm going to show you like this run from January of 2003 through about 3 weeks ago. They're the spot prices on the London Metal Exchange, with the exception of this one, which is a Chicago price for scrap iron. The United States doubled molybdenum exports to China from 2003 to 2005. In 2005, 2 molybdenum manufacturers of molybdenum products in Denver had difficulty buying it. One of them actually dropped the line from his line because he couldn't get it. The other one had tremendous difficulty in getting it. It struggled through. But Colorado is the #1 producer of molybdenum in the United States, and yet you had shortages. And the price dramatically increased. It's now around $30 to $35 a pound. Gold is at a 26-year high. These are all percentage price increases on the London Metal Exchange, again from 2003 through about 3 weeks ago. Silver is the highest it's been since the Hunt brothers drove up the price in the 80s. Platinum is at a 27-year high. Palladium, another platinum mineral, and ruthenium, another platinum group mineral. And you may have heard about these base metals, nickel, zinc, aluminum. China's the world's largest consumer of aluminum. Now, lead, zinc have gone down a bit. That's probably from new production coming on since they're normally mined together. Tin. But have you heard about antimony lately? Bismuth? You say, well, wait a minute, man, selenium's dropped way back. Now it's only 8 times what it was in 2003. You can be thankful for that. Titanium's really the only one that's back lower than where it was in 2003, and that's probably because the major use of titanium is in white paint, and when you've got a housing collapse like we have here, you're not using much white paint. Vanadium's dropped back a lot too. It's now only 12 times what it was in 2003. One of the things that's very, very important, we haven't seen these prices really. They're not obvious to us. Oil and natural gas are all sold on the spot market. So everybody in the United States knows what the spot market for crude oil is doing, because every time we fill up our gas tank, we know whether crude oil's gone up or we know whether it's gone down. It's an instantaneous feedback. And we all fill our cars, and we know what we're filling it with, and we know that it comes from crude oil, so we know it. But these other commodities, other than natural gas and oil, are not mostly sold on the spot market. And all these prices I showed you were the spot market. Coal, I think, illustrates this point very clearly. The price of Colorado coal went from $17 a ton to $37 a ton in a 2-year period. And yet, when coal was $37 a ton on the spot market in Colorado in 2005, the average price of coal sold in Colorado was $24.45 a ton, because most coal is sold on long-term fixed price contracts. But when those contracts expire and they turn over, 2 years later, the average price of coal sold in Colorado was $29.75. It had already gone up $5 a ton. So what that spot market for all of these minerals is telling us that we're going to continue to see price increases of all of these materials. This is not a wage price inflation that we're in today. It's in a natural resources driven inflation. And unfortunately, I don't think that many people in Washington understand this. So when I hear Chairman Bernanke say that he's going to do something about inflation, it worries me, because it's not a normal inflation, and he's liable to do something to us instead of for us. Cement is another one. China was exporting cement in 2002. In 2003, they began importing it. And they also tied up the ships. Because we have to import 22% in this country, suddenly we had 27 states with a shortage of cement. The next year it was 38 states. Notice that Colorado didn't have one unless you talked to anybody in Colorado who had anything to do with cement. We had a horrible shortage. We finally made it by 2005. Top producers in the world, you've seen those 3 countries before. And one of the things that's interesting is that most of our cement manufacturing is foreign owned, as are more and more of our extractive industries becoming foreign owned. What are the implications of our extractive industries being largely foreign owned when we have global shortages of commodities? The Chinese know exactly what they're doing. They're going around the world and tying up every kind of raw material all over the world. In fact, they just signed an agreement with BHP Billiton about 5 months ago, the world's largest mining company, an Australian company, and the agreement was to go around the world and buy up small and medium-sized mines. No definition of what kind, just buy them all up. And having watched this for 4 or 5 years, they've already got the low-hanging fruit tied up. Now they're going to get the rest of it tied up. Okay, I'd like to look at energy in these 3 countries also. This is how our energy in the United States is split up. It's used in these sectors, and you can see we're 40% dependent on oil, our largest area. But one of the things that's really a problem for us is these are the imports that we have. 90% of our uranium, 2/3 of our oil, and 16% of our natural gas. And looking at it a little bit differently here, 94% of our energy in this country comes from our 4 conventional energy sources. The 6% that we have down here, most of that, as you can see from that chart, is hydroelectric and biomass. And this is just kind of a reality check. If you think we're going to replace quickly our energy sources, if we increased our solar and wind by 10 times over in the next 5 years, which would be a tremendous goal, and which hopefully we can do, and we better be doing, because I think we're going to need every energy source that we can get in the future, look where it would put you. So it is a huge, huge problem to replace what we're using now. Look at the percentage price increases. Oil went up 306%, but coal's gone up 381, uranium 481, and natural gas nearly 2/3 of what oil's gone up. But remember, the coal and the oil, we haven't seen those full impacts yet, or the coal and the uranium, we haven't seen those full impacts yet. And of course, coal's the only one that we don't have to import. All right, I'd like to run through several of these categories. Natural gas. China likes natural gas. They have to import none of it at this point. India likes natural gas. They have to import nearly 1/3 of it. Natural gas in the United States. We liked it during the 90s, but we've plateaued, which I think is good. but we have to import about 16% of it. Why do I think it's good? One of the real shocks in the 2005 ASPO conference was when Matt Simmons informed me that we had peaked in natural gas in this country in 1973. And I was in the industry for more than 2 decades, and I didn't realize this, and I can tell you that most people in the industry today don't realize that. Today, we're only capable of producing about 89% of that peak. And if we look at the history of consumption of natural gas in the United States, we had supply disruptions back in the 70s. We had factories and schools shut down because there wasn't enough gas to heat them or to run them. And so people didn't really trust natural gas as a reliable fuel. Industries did everything they could to get off of them or to be able to fuel switch. At the same time, we deregulated gas, and there was a lot of crazy drilling going on in the 70s, and because consumption was going down and we were doing some crazy drilling, we had a temporary oversupply of gas called the gas bubble. And by the 80s, the price was in the tank, and I went to this love fest in Houston between the environmental community and the natural gas community, and the idea was we have this endless supply of clean, cheap fuel, and let's start using it. We had natural gas-powered cars and buses and all that good stuff, and it worked. We increased our consumption dramatically, and a lot of that was in electrical power plants. So we increased a lot of our electrical generation, get rid of that nasty black coal and replace it with this clean commodity. The problem was we didn't have the natural gas domestically to fuel those plants. We fueled them with Canadian gas by and large by importing it. We're now just under 4 trillion cubic feet of imports from Canada each year, which is just about what we're burning in the natural gas powered plants. So why is that a problem? Well, the red line is Canada's natural gas production, and you notice it's been flat in the 21st century. And they are using more and more of theirs each year. And the black that you probably can't read above the red line says that in 2006, it required 5,100 more wells per year than in 2001. So they're drilling more wells and they're getting less volume out of them. And last fall, the Canadian National Energy Board put out a report, and their reference case said that exports were going to decrease 30% in the next 7 years. Well, guess where they're exported to? So all we have to do is, we're doing all this great drilling, we got all this shale gas, no real problem, right? Well, maybe, maybe not. We have the largest, the highest rig count that we've had in 20 years in this country. And these rigs are much more efficient and they drill wells much quicker. And so we're getting more wells per rig drilled than we were 20 years ago. The price of natural gas is the highest it's ever been in history. And with all of this increase in rigs drilling, you would think that we'd be doing well. And the industry says we are doing well. We've increased reserves in the 20th century by 19%. But just like oil, it's not about reserves, it's about the flows. And through 2006, the production decreased 6%. We did get a nice kick last year for the first time, but notice that we're not even back to where we were in 2000. And we're putting all of our eggs in the natural gas basket. 92% of all the planned power plants in this country are natural gas. We took 49 coal-fired power plants off the table last year. This is a monthly production for natural gas since 1995 through 2007. You can see that there's not a particularly much of a change there. We've been relatively flat. And in 1995, it took about 9,000 wells to have our production where it was. It took over 3 times that in 2007. So we're spending more money to drill more wells, and we're getting less gas out of them. And the Rockies show what's going on here in terms of the problem. The Rockies, the average reserves per well are way below half of what they were just a decade ago, and the average initial production is about half what it is. And you can see that the Rockies, even with all of this, is where we're getting the bulk of our increased production, have gotten it, and here's the EIA optimistic forecast for the future. Hopefully it's not as bad as most of their optimistic forecasts for natural gas have been. And as a result, the price of natural gas for 2 decades was running at $2 an MCF plus or minus 50 cents, and then now we're more than 3 times that. And the volatility of natural gas is just incredible. I testified before the Colorado PUC Commission in July, and I was talking about how the price was $8 an MCF in April, $13.50 when I was testifying in July. Now Colorado natural gas is back to about $4 an MCF. How on earth can you plan your business as a company or as a Public Utilities Commission with that kind of volatility? Coal. China likes coal, as we've seen quite nicely illustrated there. They have to import a little bit. They were able to produce all they needed up until December of 2006. That was a bad month for the world because they began importing that time. There was the price when they began importing it of Appalachian coal, $38 a ton. That's what it was 3 weeks ago, $140 a ton. Remember, we haven't seen all this price increase yet. Until those contracts turn over, it'll just slowly hit us. India likes coal. They have to import 15%, up from 7%. U.S. likes coal, but we don't have to import any of it, or we liked coal. Together, these 2 countries produce and consume over half the coal in the world. Nuclear. China likes nuclear. India likes nuclear, and they both want a lot more. China announced in 2005 17 new reactors in the next 7 years. Can you imagine the United States building 17 nuclear reactors in 7 years? Our last one came on in 1996 and it was permitted in the 70s. And the question, of course, is what's happened since then? And I've polled about 15,000 people on this and they all think the same thing that I did, that it's been flat or down. When I saw this chart, I couldn't believe it. And I checked it in 2 other places. It's true. This is the best kept secret in the United States. And everybody thinks France is the largest generator of nuclear power because 70% of their electricity comes from nuclear. But we're the largest generator of nuclear power in the world by far, nearly double the number 2 and nearly triple the number 3. Second best kept secret in the United States. How come we don't know this? So we have a bunch of nuclear reactors around the world. They need 180 million pounds of uranium each year. We need 60 million pounds in this country alone. And the world produces about 100 to 110 million pounds per year. So we have a huge gap. How have we been doing that? Well, we built up huge stockpiles in the last uranium boom before Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island. And we've been living off of that stockpile, as well as we've been converting nuclear weapons to peaceful uses. The weapons are about converted and the stockpiles about used up, so the markets know that. And for the price had been running at about $10 a pound for decades. It hit over $137 a pound last year. These are the prices of contract prices, which have settled back around $80 a pound, only 8 times what the price was in 2003. Oil, I'm not going to say a lot about that because we have a few other talks about oil at this conference, but China likes oil. They have to import over 50%. Last year they imported under 50%. India likes oil. They have to import more than 2/3. And the U.S. likes oil, and we have to import over two-thirds of our oil. So here are these 3 major countries all fighting for oil in a tight market and wanting to increase more and more all the time. Something's got to give. So as a result, oil shale's been looked at again somewhat seriously. I served as Colorado's representative on the RD&D projects, and I'd like to, you can hear on the news today, this is Rifle, Colorado, and this is the thickest oil shale in the world and richest oil shale in the world. You hear that oil shale development's being blocked in the West. Anybody heard that? Yep. I'd like to just comment on that a second. Gail Norton, when she was Secretary of the Interior, directed the BLM to make lands available for the industry to demonstrate that they could produce commercial oil shale. There was a round and a request for proposals. It was open to the entire industry. Industries were submitted, or projects were submitted by the largest oil company in the world, International Oil Company, and also by small oil companies. There were 20 projects that were submitted. They were reviewed. 6 awards were made, 5 in Colorado and 1 in Utah. These companies were allowed to select the 160 acres that they would get free to conduct their research and to demonstrate that they could commercially produce it. Didn't cost them a penny to get the acreage. They all selected right in that red, which is the thickest, richest oil shale anywhere in the world, more than a quarter-mile thick of the richest oil shale right there in that red circle. On top of that, they were allowed to select their own selection, 5,000 additional acres, that if they could demonstrate that they could commercially produce oil shale, they got that 5,000 acres for fair market value with no competition with the rest of the industry. That's 30,000 acres for these 6 projects. The average that's used out here, and remember this is the richest part, but let's just use the average of 2 million barrels per acre. That's 60 billion barrels of oil they have the rights to right now. All they have to do is demonstrate that they can commercially produce oil shale. And there's not even an active permit in the state departments to look at. Somehow, I have a hard time buying that there's anybody blocking oil shale development in the West. This is a list. We're going to go to alternative energy, right? This is a list of minerals that are used in photovoltaics, fuel cells, thermoelectric materials. Every single one of these, we have to import at least 50% of what we need. I've got the prices on 15 of these 20. The average price increase since 2003 is more than 700%. And we have to import a lot of, some of them 100%. Hydro, not going to mention much about that. One of the things that I think is a positive in all this from an oil standpoint is we've proven in this country that we can conserve a lot. When the price got to be outrageously high at $35 a barrel, we cut out 3.4 million barrels per day. And we all know that we haven't even gotten a good start on that this time around. And that's something that we can do relatively quickly. Another thing that I just wanted to quickly mention, one of the most underappreciated, I think, opportunities to save energy in this country, and China knows that this is going on. This is a 690-unit apartment complex that's going in where they're using geo-exchange heat pumps. These things save 30 to 40% efficiency. They're a lot better if they can be put in up front, but you can retrofit large buildings and homes. And Western Colorado is doing this with gusto, and it's working beautifully. So I think there are a number of things that are kind of take away from this and substitute U.S. for Coloradans. We'll all suffer from continued effects of inflation because these minerals permeate all of the commodities that we use every day. And the real question is, are we going to be able to get what we need at any price, like the molybdenum example that I cited? The prices are going up, but of course, we don't make much stuff anymore, and China does. As long as they'll keep selling us the finished products, maybe we don't need the raw materials at all. And the pressure to develop Western Colorado is much the same as when Jimmy Carter said, you know, we're going to make Western U.S. an energy wasteland. We're going to take that energy that we need from Western U.S. And this book was written 25 years ago by a former governor of Colorado, and it reads like it was written last week. So we're going to have increasing problems, this problem of multinational corporations. And the real issue is how can we turn this situation that we're in the United States into a positive event. Hopefully it's not too late, although many of us, I think, are concerned that it perhaps may be. Thank you.
Am I live here? We're going to run this until 5:10, so hopefully we've got about 20 minutes to take care of some questions. First, a note from Steve Andrews. There will be a pop quiz on Vince's talk to get a free beer at the bar. I like working with this guy, I'll tell you. The other question I have here is when will the ASPO conference be held in Beijing? Try to go through a lot of these quickly. First, for David, you mentioned Chinese use of biomass. What kinds of things do they do with what kinds of biomass?
It's primarily a heating and cooking fuel for the rural residents, and it's rice husks, corn husks. Basically, it's crop residue for the most part. There's not that much open firewood that's collected, and that's been banned in most places because of deforestation. So it's largely crop residues.
You got me there? This one for Vince. We've heard a lot here about reverse globalization. If that happens, how will that affect China's consumption of resources and thus spot prices of minerals and commodities?
Reversed globalization?
Reverse globalization, the Rubin idea that because the costs of transportation are going up so high, commodities energy prices are going to drive production back to the places that are ultimately consuming the product. That the United States will be importing, for instance,
Right.
less steel from China because prices are going up.
Well, I'm not really, you notice that there was nothing in there but the EIA that was a forecast, and I've sort of learned in my career to kind of stick with what I know has happened, and so I'd prefer not to make a forecast. There's so many unknowns in all of this, a SARS virus or it's just, it's too hard to really predict, I think, what's going to happen. But if you take a look at what has happened, it's pretty sobering.
Okay. Can go either way, I guess, but probably mostly from David's talk. In terms of water used for coal to liquids, how clean does the water need to be? Can it be reused, the water in the CTL process?
Actually, in the Chinese process today, very little of it can be recycled, and so they have a disposal problem. The 10 tons I cited was fresh makeup water. There is some recycling, so the net draw on water resources is rather high.
And follow up on that actually with what is the energy loss of clean coal power plants?
Well, clean coal, I really got to say, is a complete oxymoron, and I think many people will agree. But this is interesting because it also shows the dynamic between the U.S. and China over how to try to cooperate on energy, and particularly in efficiency. The U.S. is putting all of its eggs in something called IGCC, or the Integrated Gasification Combined Cycle, which is a way to gasify the coal. You can optionally capture the carbon out of it, and then to use basically a gas turbine to generate. And you can get, theoretically, pretty high efficiencies of about 46%, compared to a typical subcritical coal plant that might give you about 34 or 35%. But this is a U.S. technology with major licenses being held for various components by the U.S. companies and by Japanese companies and other foreign companies. And China generally doesn't like to become dependent in critical energy infrastructure on other people's licensing. And so they have developed something called ultra-supercritical power generation, which basically pumps up the pressure, pumps up the temperature, and can achieve about, at least in their demo plants, they have 2 demo plants, about 44%. So they look at 46% theoretically on an IGCC and 44% on a ultra-supercritical power plant, and which they can build themselves. And they've decided that's what they're going to do. And so it's completely derailed 10 years of discussion between the U.S. and China over clean coal, because our intent really has been, it's the Department of Energy's intent, to sell this IGCC technology to China. We had a future gen project in Illinois that's been muffed. China was a part of that. That did not set well with them. They do plan to look at it in their own technology development at some point in the future. But the real kicker in all this is that it's being offered both in China and the U.S. as an option of way to do carbon sequestration. And what you got to realize is that you can take a 46% efficient coal power IGCC high technology coal fired plant, take out the carbon, compress it, pump it into the ground, but you're derating that plant by 25 to 30%, which means that the energy, you have to then dig that much more coal to generate that much more electricity because you're diverting so much of what you're generating into this carbon sequestration route. And then that has its own consequences. I mean, again, the mercury deposition from burning the extra coal that's being used to generate the power to run the carbon sequestration and so forth and so on. And so, China and the U.S. have two different routes to how they think coal can become cleaner, but in the end, there's nothing really clean.
So a resource question here for Vince. Would you comment on lithium with respect to advanced batteries for plug-in hybrids?
Well, I've had some people ask that last time, and I've looked, and I can't really get any useful information out of the public domain on lithium. It's an important question.
Okay. Question here from Matt on, Julian Simon wrote a book in the early 80s, The Ultimate Commodity, and I think that referred to human ingenuity, right? Was that what he was talking about in that book? Simon's book stated that all natural resource commodities fall by 50% in cost to produce each decade. All natural resource commodities fall by 50% in cost to produce each decade. This led to massive depression in commodity prices. Was this the ultimate economist's folly? Why did so many economists believe him?
Well, I can't say why so many economists believed him, and I certainly don't see that that's happening at all in recent history.
Okay. Yes, Simon won the famous bet with Paul Ehrlich in the 80s. It worked for 10 years, I guess, if not since then. Question here on quality of the resource. How will the decline in resource, or I should say, how will the decline in reserve-based quality, that is the shift from high BTU content coal to low quality brown coal, affect domestic production and the ability to meet demand?
I think the question answers itself. It's going to be much worse. And one of the problems I think that we face for domestic production is, in this country, we don't really track who's buying what of our resources. And China's over here buying some of our resources. I've at least heard that, know that it's true. Many of the mining claims that have been filed in the western U.S. and Colorado, for instance, we've had 30,000 mining claims filed in federal land in the last 3 years, and most of that's for uranium. Over half of the mining claims that have been filed in the western U.S. in the last 3 years have been foreign-owned companies. So we may have these reserves that are within our borders, but we may not end up controlling them.
In the case of China, this actually will be an issue that I looked at. China's coal reserves, they have a fairly high proportion of bituminous coal. Bituminous and anthracite, it's over 80%, about 20% is lignite and below. And yet, if you look at their production structure, 95% of it is bituminous. And so they're actually, of course, rationally drawing down their highest quality coal first. And so I looked at what would a 5% shift in that extraction mix mean if they extracted 90% bituminous and 10% lignite, which I think the U.S. shift by going to Wyoming was even much greater. It would require, for that same demand path I showed for 2020, for them to mine an additional 150 million tons of material each year to derive the same number of BTUs delivered. So that in turn then transfers through to the water needs during mining and for the transport needs and so forth and so on. So it's significant.
Here's a question for Vince on cement. Is cement moved in world trade, even across oceans?
Yes, we have 22% of ours, and as I said, the Chinese tied up the ships when they began importing it.
Okay. A lot of people in here are used to studying oil and gas. You use them, you burn them up. That's not necessarily the case with a lot of these metals. A paper from Yale a few years ago estimated that half of all copper ever produced is currently in use. The other half was in landfills. Do you see the mining of landfills in the future?
I think that we probably are going to have to go to that for some of the mineral commodities that we need. Obviously, there are all kinds of ramifications of that. You know, tearing up landfills is going to probably take a little thought before it actually happens, I think.
Okay. There's several questions here, and I think we'll talk about this a little bit tomorrow, but several questions that reference T. Boone Pickens, and also the new gas sources that we're talking about in Louisiana and elsewhere. How much does this play a role? I'm trying to summarize these here in pushing back. How much additional production can we expect from these new shale sources?
Well, there's a lot of controversy about that. In fact, there are the CEOs of two companies that are active in the plays down in Louisiana. One of them has publicly accused the other one of hyping what's down there. The other one has claimed that it's all based on science and there's no hype. I think that we could see a bump, and the bump that we saw in 2007 included both Rockies gas and some Texas gas increase for the first time. There may be some initial bump up, but I think that it's still that trash gas that we used to talk about when I was in the industry, that it's got very high decline rates. And as you look at, there have been a couple of analyses that have been done of the shale gas plays where you have to keep drilling more and more just to keep flat. And some of my friends in the industry called it our dirty little secret in the Piceance Basin. When you look at those curves, each well gives an incrementally smaller amount of gas because of the very steep decline curves. So you're trying to offset the decline of these marvelous offshore wells that are, you know, really true world-class reservoirs that are declining very rapidly, and you're not replacing it with anything near that kind of production. So it costs an awful lot more to produce that kind of gas. The capital requirements are just unbelievable to get large volumes even for a short period of time. And boy, once you start, I've seen some scenarios based on the actual production that if you stop drilling in Colorado just for a year, the production would just tumble.
Okay. David, I have several questions here that relate to national security issues. This one says, today Venezuela's Hugo Chavez announced an accord to provide more oil to China. Can you identify some specific resource targets around the world where the U.S. is in potential competition or conflict with China?
Everywhere. I mean, we've seen it quite a bit already. I mean, when China moved big time in Angola, who is now China's first top source in Africa for crude oil, the U.S. complained bitterly about how unfair it was, which meant we didn't win, how China was distorting the economics, which meant that someone didn't pay off someone enough, and so forth. And China basically grabbed that away from what a lot of American companies wanted. We've come into conflict in Sudan over this through human rights, but also through geopolitics. We're going to see there's the whole South China Sea problem where China claims ownership of the entire amount, even though it's bordered by Philippines, Vietnam, Brunei, Malaysia, and all these other countries that lay claim to that, with U.S. expectation that they provide security in that area. I think Africa is a big battleground between, you know, neo-colonialism and colonialism, basically.
I'd just add a couple of comments. You remember when China tried to buy Unocal a few years ago? A lot of people think it really wasn't for the oil, although the oil would have been a sidelight, but Unocal owned the Mountain Pass rare earth deposit on the California-Nevada border. China already controls 98% of the rare earths in the world, and that would have pretty well completed it for them. The strategy that China has for going around and tying this stuff up is so far beyond what we're capable of, because our society is so much different. The State Department asked me to take a guy from Samoa, not American Samoa, but the other half of the island, around and show him what we were doing in emergency preparedness. And we started talking about China at lunch, and he said, you know, China's putting about $200 million a year into our tiny little economy, and it's huge. And there's only one reason that they're doing it, and that's to buy up our vote in the UN, and they're doing it in every Pacific Island nation out here. I mean, their strategy is all-encompassing, and they've thought it through, and they're executing it in an unbelievable manner.
This question is sort of a batting practice pitch, so we'll see how hard you want to hit it. China seems to be able to ship their pollution to the U.S. for free. Should we be charging them?
Well, I think, you know, California certainly exported a lot of our foregone pollution to China. I mean, it's true, and this is actually a big debate in the upcoming Copenhagen round, is the idea that if you have a carbon-intensive economy like China exporting to a country that has carbon caps, can you impose any kind of a tax or tariff to be able to adjust for that difference between it? And it's being looked at here in California through a number of studies on life cycle analyses of products that are produced in the U.S. versus products that are produced in China, which to me is a more robust way to capture what that whole carbon imprint is. But you come upon certain problems because are you importing from China something that you otherwise would have produced yourself? Are you importing from China something that you wouldn't otherwise consume, but because it's cheap from China, you're consuming it? And then there's how much of China's, how much of China's economic activity is driven by this export sector anyway? And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding there too. You know, a lot of what we import from China is cheap, mid to low tech, and I think, as Jeff Rubin's piece demonstrated, has a very low value to shipping cost ratio and will probably disappear on its own. But this kind of activity where nominally China's exports are about 35–40% of its GDP is a really bad comparison and a bad way to look at what China is exporting to us. And you have to look at it value added to value added. And the only study that's looked at China's exports in terms of value added calculation shows that it's only about 10%. And so the U.S. market is important to China, but it's not the source of most of China's consumption. And so it's China's and the U.S. pollution of the grand global common that we should be more concerned about and deal with trade through separate channels.
Colorado question here. Are coal-fired plants being considered to give the energy needed to extract oil out of shale?
That really hasn't been addressed. The oil shale is in the area where there are a lot of coal reserves. I think that Shell is publicly committed to having a carbon neutral operation out there if they do it, sequestering any CO2 that's generated, and I think that they probably would consider nuclear over coal, but none of that's been decided. But they are buying up lots of water rights.
Okay. David, in the U.S. we're about to get blindsided because we've relied on bad EIA figures. What's China's problem? Do they have bad data too that's keeping them on an unsustainable path?
Yeah, they got bad data. It's the responsibility of the National Bureau of Statistics in China to gather data. And the problem that we have seen perennially is the way that they structure that statistical administration in China. And there's a provincial level office that feeds up to the national level office. And in the past, the evaluation of provincial governors would be based upon how much economic growth they delivered and how many capital assets were put into place and so forth. And so there was this incentive at the provincial level to increase certain numbers before they were fed up, or decrease other numbers before they were fed up to the central government. That became such a problem that last year, or 2 years ago, they completely revamped the structure when they set out this 2010 target, and they cut out that provincial massaging layer. And now all the enterprises have to report directly to the National Bureau of Statistics what their consumption is. And so those numbers have become a lot more reliable. Where China really falls down, that the US actually has good data on, is how is energy used. It's not enough to know that it's used in transportation, agriculture, or industry. You have to know how much of that is air conditioners or refrigerators or lighting or heating or cooling, because your policies to affect your energy consumption is based upon how you're using energy, not what energy you're using. And in the US, we're actually lucky, although unfortunately they've stopped doing these surveys. We have a residential energy consumption survey, a commercial building energy consumption survey, and a manufacturer's energy consumption survey that gives us this wealth of data about how Americans use energy. In China, they have none of that. I mean, I've worked with China for 5 years now to try to find funding to bring them to EIA to be trained on how to do these end-use surveys. And there's a lot of enthusiasm, but it's very hard to find any funding for something like that. That means that Chinese policy making on energy efficiency and on trying to guide energy use among these various sectors is crippled because they simply don't know how it's all used.
We are out of time. Thank you. Vince, David. Don't run out of here like we do after all the other panels. If you'd hang on, we have some closing comments. I think Steve, or is it Debbie right here?
Right here.
You're already there.
Thank you. If this is your first ASPO conference, maybe you've made the same observation that I made in 2005 in Denver, and that there's this reluctance of people to even leave the room to use the restroom for fear they would miss a response like we've heard in this last panel. That was certainly my observation. We've always had a kind of a summary wrap-up, and tonight, this afternoon, is going to be the infamous Robert Hirsch. I guess I have to admit that Robert is one of those people, one of the heroes that I have found coming to these conferences. Somebody that I have to admit I've kind of been secretly stalking, because I quite often will Google these people and look for presentations they've made so that I can hear them again. And he has certainly been one of those. He is the author, one of the co-authors of the infamous Hirsch report, and I was so proud of myself in 2005 that I went to Denver with a copy of it hot off the press. And Roger, he was also the co-author. The other co-author was Roger Bezdek, and there's the third guy, but I'm sorry, I don't know who that was. He is a former senior energy program advisor for the Science Applications International Corporation, and is a senior energy advisor at MISI, and a highly valued advisor to ASPO-USA. So I'm very pleased to introduce Robert Hirsch.
Can we get some help with slides? I've got 3 slides I wanted to use. Okay. What Steve Andrews asked me to do was to give some wrap-up comments, hit some highlights, try to give you my view of what it is I've heard. It seems to me that we have heard yesterday and today an excellent array of presentations and a lot of really good discussion, questions, and so forth that goes with that. So there's no way that I can be fair to everybody and comprehensive in what it is I do. So what I'm going to try to do is to hit a number of items that struck me and resonated with me, and hopefully that'll help you as you digest the material that we've had, which is really difficult to digest. Yes, I did. Hirsch. industry. First of all, from some of the things that I've been doing, I'd like to make just a couple of remarks to you. First of all, with respect to terminology, peak oil is something that we've been living with for a long time. It's a great phrase, it's nice, it's compact, and so forth. For many people, though, it tends to mean a sharp peak like occurred in the United States, lower 48 states. In fact, what it is we have been dealing with, at least the way I look at things, since the middle of 2004, is a liquid fuels, oil, black oil, and NGLs and some bitumen and so forth, a fluctuating plateau. That plateau has been going on, as I said, since the middle of 2004. When you look at a plateau in this business, you can't expect something that is straight flat. If you look at any of the data, and a lot of the data was shown here, you see lots of spikes up and down. And so if you're going to look at a plateau, you need to decide beforehand what the width of that plateau is in order to judge whether or not you've gone above or below a reasonable plateau period. From work that I did, I looked at Europe, and they were on a plateau for 6 years, and the bandwidth for their fluctuations was about 3%. If indeed you look at North America, 16 years at a plateau, it was about 4%. So 3 to 5% is something like the kind of bandwidth you ought to take a look at. So when you hear people talking about hundreds of thousands of barrels or a couple million barrels up or down and so forth, you really need to put that in some kind of a context. The most important event that is coming, that at least the way I look at things, is the onset of decline. That to me means that the kind of plateau that we're on now, plus or minus future fluctuations, is going to break and go into decline, and that's of course when the world is in the most severe trouble. Another point that I'd like to make to you is that small numbers are very important, and many of you know this. 5% decline in oil to the U.S. in 1973 led to recession. So it doesn't take much in the way of percentage declines, and we're looking at declines that are will compound year after year in order to lead to significant financial and economic troubles. The other thing is that, and this is easy of course, is that 1% of world oil consumption is enormous. 650,000 barrels a day is a huge number in terms of how what you'd have to do to produce that from some other means to produce liquid fuels, or to conserve that with conservation. The other thing, though, is you've got to think that 3 to 5% changes in oil production, either up or down, cannot be identified as true trends because of this fluctuating plateau until years later. In other words, you're going to have to wait. You're not going to be able to say that it was on such and such a date because you can't be sure until you have enough data to see that you've got an upward acceleration or a decline. Lastly, many people would like to have the date of when decline will occur, and that's a natural thing. It's a natural human thing, it seems to me. Many people feel that the decline is going to begin in something like 2 to 5 years. And with the world being as complicated as it is in so many ways, I don't think one can do much better than that. But it really doesn't make any difference, because from the work that we've done and others have done, it's going to take us something like 20 years to catch up with this problem. 20 years to catch up with this problem. And so we really should have started quite some time ago. The time scales and how you phase things, the longer you wait, of course, the worse it's going to be. The other point is that I think it's very important for everybody in this audience, no matter what your situation is, to think about what this problem is going to mean to you personally. If you're at my age and reasonably well through your professional career and your finances are reasonable, that's good, but better take a hard look at those finances, because where you have your money is very important in a situation where we're going into oil production decline. That's going to hurt just a whole lot of the normal standard things, or at least normal as of a couple of weeks ago, normal standard things where people would put their money. So everybody needs to do that. And also think about your jobs. If you're a younger person, things you might get into and things that you may be into right now. If you're involved in business, you need to think very carefully about alternate scenarios in terms of what these things might mean to you. And of course, the thing that we haven't been able to really move yet is major national and international changes and rethinking. Okay, let me try to get through a number of things that have occurred to me that have been talked about, and maybe that I'll add a little bit to also. This past week was really traumatic. I was in a situation where I was able to watch television fairly frequently, and it was just downright frightening if you understood what was going on. It occurred to me that this past week was maybe prototypical of the week when peak oil is really realized in the public. It isn't realized yet. There may be 4 million hits on Google, and there are all kinds of good people here that are writing about this, all kinds of people trying to get the information out, but it is not realized yet in the public. When that realization occurs, I think there's going to be hell to pay that week and the weeks following. I think a whole lot of the bad things that happened this past week are going to happen again, and worse will happen because there is no quick fix to this problem. In other words, I would suggest that we all spend some time understanding this past week, because we're going to have it in spades when we go into decline. A number of interesting phrases. I've always been big, my father was big on one-liners. He had a number of one-liners that I couldn't repeat in a mixed audience. But there were a number of one-liners here that I thought were extremely expressive, and so I'm going to touch on some of those and also expand on a few. There was the term willful human blindness. And if you think about that phrase, it really does describe part of the problem that we have in communicating with decision makers. Somebody talked about it was helpful that we're at the stage that we are today in the evolution of peak oil, its understanding, and eventually getting the world to pay attention and do something about it. And there was a nice little run-up overview of the stages that we've gone through. You've heard about some of the early meetings, Shale Alacolette and others putting things together. You could go back to Colin Campbell and John LaHerrera's Scientific American article and so forth. We've gone through a number of stages, and we are in a stage now, but we're not really where we want to get to. There was talk about global warming, and there were some people that quite understandably think that we ought to be treating global warming and peak oil in the same way. I find that difficult personally, because while there is no question that, in my mind at least, that there is warming in the world, and that has all of the people concerned, there are people who believe that it's because of us, and that may or may not be correct. But the thing that is obvious to me is that when people are hurting badly, when they're losing their jobs, when they're losing their cars, when they're destitute, when they're not sure what it is they're going to do to survive, and that's the kind of thing we're talking about when peak oil hits. When those things hit, people are going to be pushing for one thing, and that is fix now. Fix now. So think about that. Think about how people will react. Think about how you might react if you're caught on the wrong end of this kind of situation. Very interesting point, a new phrase that I heard, peak roads. And the idea there very simply was that we probably have enough roads as you look ahead, not too far into the future. Don't talk with your hands. You look too far into the future, and we probably, in many places, have enough roads now. And rationally speaking, I think there's an argument that could be made. But the thought that jumped to my mind is, think about going up against the road building lobby. Because one of the problems we've got in all of this is there are a lot of entrenched special interests. And a lot of those special interests are not necessarily negative. They are real folks that live and work and are trying to take care of themselves. Okay, there was a phrase, the proactive choir. We here are the proactive choir because we're interested in this problem and we are here, we've spent time to come here and contribute and so forth. And what was suggested is as we make these points and try to convince people in positions of responsibility, keep it simple, the old KISS business, keep it simple, don't mix it with a lot of other things. Try to give people an idea of why this is and what the substance is behind it, and don't mix it with too many other things because that gets very complicated. In fact, the subject alone is complicated enough. Point was made that panic is likely required for real action. I deplore that, but I think it's realistic. I think that there are so many things going on right now, and there are so many problems that policymakers in particular have at the present time, that they're going to have to get hit by the proverbial 2x4 before they really begin to take serious action. I wish it wasn't that way. One of the things that hasn't been covered thus far, and of course you can't cover everything in the first day and a half, is the issue of rates of change. And I would encourage any of you that haven't done so to begin to do some back of the envelope. It may take a couple of envelopes to do it. But take a look at the rates of change that we're talking about. That 1% equal 860,000 barrels a day, and we're talking about 3 to 5% decline rates, and how long it takes to bring in new vehicles in a recessionary period and so forth, and how long it takes to build coal to liquids plants or those shale plants or a number of the other things that we're talking about. Spend some time looking at rates of change. The more you look at it, the more you see that this problem initially is going to run away from our best efforts. State and local governments are beginning to take a look at this, and I think it's wonderful. I appeared in Santa Barbara, and the folks in Santa Barbara, a number of people are willing to talk about opening up drilling offshore there. A number of folks are beginning to think seriously about this. As they do that, you have to go through the shock phase, because as you begin to think about this, it's a shock, and it is definitely very difficult. As the state and local folks begin to think about it, they've got to, as was mentioned, think about demand destruction, which a number of people think is a good idea, but to state and local government, it means a loss of taxes. That's very important. None of these things happen in isolation. The other thing is, with much higher fuel costs, how many police patrol cars are you going to have out there? How many ambulances and so forth? That's a whole set of things that really requires much more effort. The barriers to convincing people about the character of the problem. There's a number of barriers that were listed. I think that the list could be longer. One of them is that there's a lot of other pressing problems. People are talking about Medicare, they're talking about Social Security, they're talking about a whole variety of different things, and to talk about peak oil, particularly when you're trying to worry about this $3.50 and $4 a gallon of gasoline, it's a tough one. This has happened before. There were people in the past, and there were good efforts that were put forward to try to manage peak oil because it was thought to happen before, so the boy cried wolf. And once the boy cried wolf, the wolf's got to eat the boy before people will pay attention. There's denial, and that gets back again to this willful human blindness. There's faith in technology, and I've been in technology my whole career, and there's no question in my mind that technology can do a lot and will do a lot in the future, but it is not a quick fix. It is simply something that is going to help us to get to where we need to go, but we're going to have to deal with things that we have right now. Faith in government. Some people might laugh at that a little bit, but in our hearts of hearts, I think we all want our governments to work efficiently. And eventually, in a lot of cases, they end up doing that. Anyway, those are the kind of things that stand in the way of getting the message out. Phrase was used related to impacts on Africa, and the phrase was used as biggest robbery in history. And I think we can all resonate with that, because I think we understand that there are people that are far less better off than we are, in Africa and what all of this means really is damage to them. But there's something else that's a short one-liner that goes with that, and that is the biggest wealth transfer in history. The money that we are paying for imported oil represents the biggest wealth transfer in history. To some people, that's abstract, but if you dig in, you don't have to dig in too far into basic economics, that's going to hurt us very, very badly. I think a conference like this is very tough to organize because there's an audience here of people that come from very different backgrounds. And for some people, there's too much geology, and for other people, there's not enough geology. In some cases, there's too much economics, in other cases, not enough, and so forth. Not enough global warming discussion, and so forth. It's tough, but I would like to salute the organizers because what they have done thus far, I think, is working out extremely well, and this is a very hard thing to do. There's something else that gets mixed up in this, and if there's one thing I say that sticks with you, I hope it's this one. Don't think of this as an energy problem. Liquid fuels. It's liquid fuels. It's a liquid fuel problem. We can't take photovoltaics and run the cars that are out on the streets now. Maybe in the future, photovoltaics will work into an electric power system that runs electric vehicles. But for the near term, we have something like $50 to $100 trillion, that's big money, of investment in vehicles and airplanes, ships, all kinds of equipment that can only operate on liquid fuels. We have got to keep those fleets going, or we shut down our economy and we'll have total anarchy. So the problem, working the problem, mitigating this problem, means that, of course, we're going to have to conserve as best we can and as fast as we can, but that doesn't happen overnight. And we have to have substitute liquid fuels, or we are all in terrible, terrible trouble. And I'm leaving out a number of the bad things that could really happen. So, yes, we have problems, and some people were talking about the electric power problems we have. And we have looming electric power problems in this country and severe problems in other places in the world. That needs to be addressed, but they need to be separated and dealt with separately. Longer term, all of this will phase into a world that is much more sustainable than what it is we have today, but we're going to have to take care of the immediate problems in order to get to that sustainable future. A lot of notes here. Point was made that about a number of the hydrocarbon liquid fuel production technologies that haven't yet solved their environmental problems. I can understand that. I think we can all understand that. But think about a different world. Don't think about the world that we live in now and the standards that we are conditioned and applying right now. Think about that world where we are in serious economic trouble. And think about the environmental standards. And don't think that we're going to trash everything, because we won't do that, and we don't have to do that, but we're going to have to make major compromises. So part of what I think we have to do in our own heads is think about what's most important from an environmental standpoint, because we don't want to screw the environment no matter what, but by the same token, we're going to have to save ourselves and a whole lot of our economies. Point was made that rebuilding our energy system will be the biggest construction effort in history. I suspect that that's right. It's going to be absolutely enormous. It's almost beyond imagination. There's going to be a lot of pain associated with the problems we're dealing with, but don't forget the word opportunities. There are going to be opportunities to contribute, and there are going to be people and organizations that win and prosper through the misery that we're talking about. There was a call for a political leader to stand up and tell it straight. And I would love that. I would really love that. I would hope that at some point, President-elect will stand up and give it straight. Give it to us straight. Give it to the public straight. But that will then get us into that week of realization that I talked about before. When that announcement is made, hopefully it'll be made with a plan as to what it is going to be done. You couldn't do it otherwise. But when that announcement is made, then this past week is going to happen again without any bailout possible. In other words, the mere announcement, which we all want to have happen, is going to cause chaos, just like happened in 1973 and 1979, when effectively the cutoff or the cutback in oil production was announced. So it isn't as simple as we think, and yet it has to happen. Globalization was based on cheap oil. I thought that point was very well made. High prices mean that shipping costs are going up very much. That's going to mean deglobalization. I think that is entirely possible, and I think there may be some opportunities in all of that. Let me keep going here and try to hit the most important things. Compromises and pragmatism. We're going to have to be pragmatic, and we're going to have to make compromises. And I know that if you've been fighting for certain things for a long period of time, that's hard, but it's going to take a whole lot of us rising above the past and our past values in order to make these kind of things happen. There was a point made about politics in a couple of places. A few people made some remarks about one party or the other. I think by and large what people have been doing is staying politically neutral on this, and from what I know about Washington, having been in and around it for a long period of time, I would urge you to carefully consider that, because we shouldn't make this a partisan issue for one side of the aisle or the other. We heard a great deal about China and the situation that's going on over there. In some respects, I wish that we could substitute the word United States for China, because I think they're doing a whole lot of things. They're able to do it. We're kind of tied up in a whole lot of everybody getting involved in everything and not making much decisions. They're moving ahead in a number of ways that I think are extremely pragmatic. Interesting that the point was made about the national oil companies, which now control most of the oil in the world, are becoming international national oil companies. They're able to go out and go into a whole lot of countries and outbid Exxon and Shell and a whole variety of the other folks. And so the big majors, the ones that we have loved to kick around in the past, in fact, are the little guys. The head of API, former head of API, called the big oil companies that we love to hate or have in the past, the little guys. And indeed they are. And that's something you need to think about also. Let me finish up here. A great phrase from some time ago is that the best is the enemy of the good. And I think about that a lot. I think when circumstances are really severe and we're headed towards that, good is the enemy of the adequate. We need to think about, again, the compromises we made. One person passed me a little note after hearing some of the less positive things that were presented, saying the U.S. is finished. It's not finished. We're not finished. What I try to do is to face these issues directly, but I've never lost my optimism. We are not going to roll over and die. We are not going to get tread into the ground. We are not going to be like the Roman Empire. We are going to reorganize ourselves. We're going to go through a whole lot of pain, and we're going to come out of this on top, because we're Americans, and that's what we do. Thank you.